fighting off an outnumbered siege, dealing with 2 different wars at the same time, and taking over my very first town? Watch all of these epic events unfold as the legacy of Inric continues. Today I played 500 days of Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord. If you haven't seen the previous videos, go check them out before this one, links down below. My adventuring had brought me into the lands of the Asurai. I really hope nothing too exciting is going on back at home. I guess I won't know until I return. Until then, I was distracted by a tournament that was going on in the nearby town of Sinala. Before I entered it though, I checked the tavern, where I found a man named Gavin Bloodaxe. We talked, and he told me that he was a part of the old Emperor's Guard. His comrades and him were blamed for the death of the Emperor, and the people turned against him. He continued telling me that his guard felt very betrayed by what happened, so they did some unspeakable things. Gavin said that he was very ashamed of what happened, and he seemed very sincere about this, so I invited him to work for me as one of my companions. This way, he could restore his honor. He gladly joined my house, and him, Sylvan, and I all joined the tournament going on at the city together. For the very first round, I was placed in a 1v1v1v1. Most tournaments were styled like this. After doing a whole bunch of hacking and slashing, I had won the round. The next one was on horseback. Unfortunately, my team was not the best. I was left in a 1v3 situation. My teammates really couldn't hold their own. I carefully took out 2 of the 3 blue team contenders. Sylvan, my wife, was the only one that still stood. It didn't feel right taking her on in the tournament. It reminded me of a while ago, back when we first competed against each other before we were married. I knew that she would still want me to try, so I just acted how I normally would against an opponent. So that's exactly what I did. I had taken her out with a lunge to the back. The third round consisted of a very intense duel. I was constantly slashing at my enemy's shield. I ended up hitting it so many times that it broke. Since there was no shield, I was able to take out the enemy swordsman in a matter of 2 swings. I then moved on to the archer, which was a breeze, and it was down to the final round, which really wasn't that hard. Nothing new, Inric on top. I then led my party away from Sinala. We made it further into the Asurai kingdom. I chased down and then started talking to a random Asari Sultan. He was named Unquid. I wanted to see if he had any cool quests that needed to be done. Sadly enough, Sultan Unquid said that I am a king of another kingdom. This meant that I couldn't be entrusted with any important quests. This kind of made me realize that being king meant that I was not able to do a lot of the things that I used to. And honestly, this was a good realization because I really just needed to focus in on running my kingdom and expanding it through war. Even me just being here now was pretty risky, as anyone could declare war on us at any second. I quickly made my way through the rest of the Asurai lands to the side that I didn't enter in on. I decided that I really only belonged near my castles, and defending them was my highest priority. On the great journey back to the Vortian lands, I had stumbled upon a forest bandit hideout. Of course I wasn't gonna let it just sit there, so I grabbed some of my most entrusted men and we started to raid the camp. My troops had moved in to attack the enemies while I pelted them with crossbow bolts. This honestly just felt like crossbow practice, and my guards were there to finish off anything that I didn't hit. Finally, the bandit leader had come out of hiding, looking to see who was destroying all of his troops. He asked me to duel, and I said very well. I really wanted to make an example of him. Just the only concern was that I had a spear and he had an axe. If I don't keep a lot of distance between us, then I'm not going to be able to even get any hits off on him. Luckily enough, I devised a plan. I just would hit him with my shield, step back, and then stab my spear at him. This proved effective. Real quick, if you're enjoying the content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for more. Right after defeating the bandit leader, we left the hideout and made it to a random imperial city. Here, I geared up Gavin with some better items and told him to form his own caravan. This caravan will provide a lot of dinars for the kingdom, and it'll also help Gavin increase his skills in stewardship, so that way he could maybe even lead a party in the future. We were almost back home, but I noticed something on the way. The Sturgians were attacking a Vlandian castle. They had over 1,000 troops in the siege, and things were not looking good for the Vlandians in this situation. I was pretty happy that I saw this on the way back home, because I now knew that the Sturgians and Vlandians were at war. This intel could lead us to getting more castles into our kingdom, especially if we declare war on Sturgia while they're at their weakest point. I'll have to keep an eye out for that. I was finally back in my own lands. When I got to the castle of Pendraic, however, I noticed that the loyalty was incredibly low. I told my sister, the city governor, to start focusing in on games and festivals. This increases the city's loyalty by 2 every single day. After hanging around the castle for some time, I was finally convinced that a rebellion would no longer happen. Our loyalty was back to 20, which was still incredibly low, but it was better than 14. I headed over to Nevian's castle just to make sure the loyalty there was also good. It seemed like everything was under control here, at least more than at Pendraic. There just so happened to be a tournament going on at Carbanseth. Since it was so close, I traveled over there so I could enter the arena and fight in the tournament. Things really didn't start off well though. We had immediately lost the other swordsmen on our team, and it was now me versus 2 enemy swordsmen. They both had shields, so it was almost impossible to be able to swing at them. I brought both of them into my archers, where one of the archers had started to help me out, and this changed the tide of the battle. We were then able to move in and take out the 2 enemy archers. The next round wasn't as intense. 2 swings and I had taken out my competitor. The third round was even easier. I just had to block twice, and then I took out the enemy within 1 swing. The final round of the tournament was a little bit longer. I had to hit the competitor at least 3 different times before they were knocked out. Now that's a tough warrior. Since I was already at a town, I decided to try out smithing. I didn't have any resources on me, so I went to the town market and bought a whole bunch of wood. I then turned that into charcoal. It wasn't long until I used up all of my smithing stamina. Honestly, this wasn't a good hobby for a king. I'll just stick to waging wars and managing castles. I received great news. Nogan's wife Nadia was with child. The Vortide family continues to grow bigger. It'll only be a matter of time before the empire is expanded with pure blood. Even though I do trust our companions in leadership positions, I really only want the Vortide family to be in power. This guarantees that no rogues will be able to take over our kingdom, and it will be a lot more secure. It appeared that some kind of siege was going on in the Sturgian lands. The Vlandians were still at it. They wanted to take over another Sturgian town. I made my way a bit further into the Sturgian lands to see if there were any castles that I could take over. Ironically enough, that was when the Battanians declared war on us. I was sweating arrows as I was pretty far away from the 2 castles a part of my kingdom. I really hope nobody takes them over while I'm gone. I was just approaching the lands of Vortia when a Battanian caravan had gotten in my path. Unfortunately enough for them, they had just declared war on me. I didn't plan on letting this caravan pass by for free. And trust me, I made them pay their toll. There was only 1 single survivor after we had gotten done with the caravan. He started to run with what little goods he could carry, and he didn't make it far until we had gotten up to him and ended this one-man army. I think karma was getting its revenge. A huge army of over 800 Battanian soldiers was approaching the castle of Pendraic. I guess I know how that one-man army felt now when I chased him down. It looked like there was another huge army of over 400 troops approaching the castle. Right when they got close enough, they had besieged it. Things were not looking good for us. I don't think we could be in a worse situation. Even though we were heavily outnumbered, it still looked like we had a fighting chance. So I started to upgrade as many troops as I possibly could. Any glimpse of hope was crushed. Another Battanian army of over 550 troops joined the siege. I really had no idea what to do. I was desperate at this point, so I started building as many catapults as I possibly could. Unfortunately, we only got 3 up by the time the enemies launched their siege. In preparations, seconds before the siege started, I rushed all of my swordsmen to the walls. This way, when the enemies climb up with ladders, we'll be able to take them out with ease. I don't want to worry about my archers dealing with enemy melee. Honestly, at this point, we were just running a Hail Mary. We were outnumbered 4-1, and things were not looking good for us. My plan was to use the catapults not on the enemy siege equipment, but on the enemy units themselves. This would hopefully take out as many troops as we possibly could, so we won't have to fight them off later. Good thing I was a mean shot on the catapult. Every single time that I had fired it, I took out at least 20 to 30 troops. The siege had progressed on, and the enemy battering ram had been destroyed by my other catapult. At this point, I was just shooting as many ballista shots as I could into the large crowds of Battanian soldiers. The strategy seemed to be working, but it was taking absolutely forever. And I'm not joking when I say forever. I think I shot off at least 40 to 50 bolts already. As our defense held strong, the enemies started to retreat. They still outnumbered us a good amount, but I don't think they were confident enough to try and take us on. That's right, keep running. I was absolutely amazed that we had won this siege. The enemies lost over 700 troops and had around 450 injured. We had less than 200 casualties. Now that's what I call a good defense. I was honestly convinced that every single Battanian general was a part of this siege. We had taken at least 10 generals prisoner just from that siege alone. The enemy forces were scattered. They didn't know what to do, so their huge army had disbanded. We were well put together and ready to take on yet another fight. So I had my party set out and we started chasing them. I was able to catch 3 Battanian generals, and this time we outnumbered them. So I sent my troops in, and with ease they had finished the battle with minimal casualties. Well, that's another 3 prisoners. The Battanians seemed desperate at this point. They started to attack my smaller parties. Luckily enough, I was in the area to assist. Yeah, that's right, you thought. If I wasn't convinced before that I had all of the Battanian generals in my custody, I was surely convinced now. I ended up having to go back to the castle of Pendraic because I couldn't carry any more loot on me. So I had unloaded all of the loot that we had gotten from all of these battles, keeping only the necessities, like horses and food. My eyes were set on Carbanseth. The only thing is, I don't have enough troops to siege that town. It had way too many defenders, 643 to be exact. One of my scouts had informed me that my village of Lindum was under siege. I went over to see what was going on, and a small party of only 16 troops was trying to attack it. Now that's just pathetic. It appeared that the Battanians were struggling to rebuild their armies. To make things even harder for them, I was taking out all of their small parties roaming around. Hey, they were the ones who started the war, don't judge me. As I roamed further into Battanian lands, I had come across the High King Caladog. This was the moment of truth. King versus king. Of course, I won. Caladog was now amongst my prisoners, and I think this is a good point in the war to say that I pretty much won it. Or did I? As I was distracted with High King Caladog, another army that was pretty large in size decided to siege Pendraic. Unluckily enough for them, I headed over immediately to the castle and was getting ready to attack them head on. I was a little bit nervous about this battle. We only had a slight advantage, and I didn't know if there were more parties to come and assist them. I immediately charged up to the side of the enemy army. They probably didn't know that it was me. I looked like a single scout seeing what their forces had. Little did they know, I am the cavalry. I immediately started charging the enemy horsemen. They didn't know what to do besides start riding away. You know, it's kind of ironic because why would a whole bunch of horsemen run away from one single horseman? Now that's the power of intimidation. I kept making my rounds as I took out enemy after enemy. I even utilized my crossbow as I rode past the large horde of enemy troops. I slowly kept picking away at the Battanian army while my troops made their way forward to join in the battle. Hold, charge! The inevitable happened. I told my troops to fully engage and not back down. My troops did exactly what I said, confidently. We had fought in together so many different times, and they knew that we had the edge in this battle. It felt like a good time to go on the offensive. I started rallying my troops and headed towards the Battanian lands. I do have to give it to them though. They raised troops at an incredible speed. We had just taken out all of their armies, and they had another 300 troops ready to fight. The downfall of this though is those troops had absolutely no experience in war. They had the numbers, but they didn't have the brains. I ended up having to retreat my troops a little bit after taking out that 300 plus enemy army. Then, the unthinkable happened. The Kingdom of Sturgia declared war on me. I was now at war with two different kingdoms. Battania was definitely going to take advantage of this. They had immediately sent over an army to put my castle under siege. I'm assuming that this was a part of their plan. Hold me at one castle until the forces of Sturgia arrived to join the siege. Little did they know I wasn't going to let this happen. Right as night fell, I sent out a little division of horsemen to try and take out the enemy siege equipment. This realistically wasn't even a battle. My troops didn't even touch the equipment, and we had just taken out all of the enemy guards defending it. This was at least 100 of the enemy troops. We now held an advantage. Oh, I spoke too soon. We were now outnumbered once again, and the siege continued on. We tried yet another ambush on the enemy siege equipment. Well, I guess I shouldn't say on the enemy siege equipment. We technically were just going out there to try and take out as many of the enemy troops that we could. This once again was a success, but we were still outnumbered heavily. After holding out for quite some time, the enemies had finally decided to invade. I ran the same strategy as last siege with all of my swordsmen on the walls. To be honest, even though we were outnumbered by quite a bit, I really wasn't that scared. We defended this castle from 1800 troops last time, so I really wasn't worried about a mere 900. Once I had everything set up perfectly, I had rushed over to one of my catapults. Immediately, I began flinging rocks at the enemies. Even though I was confident about this fight, I needed to ensure that we actually did win. After quite some time, the enemy battering ram had arrived directly in front of our gates. I headed down a level to start throwing stones at it, and that was when I realized the enemies were retreating. This was incredibly odd because they still had a lot of troops left. I wonder why they gave up so easily. Hey, I guess I'm not gonna complain. Right as the siege ended, I had seen two parties of Battanian troops. One was around 350 and the other was around 100. Of course, I attacked the army of 300 as I wanted to take out the bigger group first. After the enemies retreated, I headed back over to the castle of Pendraic. I wanted to drop off all of the loot that I had gotten from the previous couple of battles. Alright boys, everything except the horses and food, let's go. After securing my loot, I then started to pursue the second Battanian party from earlier. It wasn't long until I had caught up to them. We did have a lot of horsemen in our party after all. When we caught up to them, we had completely destroyed them. They only had around 100 weak troops, while we had around 120 well-seasoned troops. All of this talk about troops made me realize that I need more. So, I ended up heading over to every single village nearby and recruiting all of the troops they had to offer. Even though we had a lot of experience in wars, I never had to fight off two different kingdoms at the same time. I was for sure feeling the pressure of this as a pretty large Sturgian party was already attacking one of my villages. I then headed over to a Battanian village to raid it. The prior Sturgian attack on one of my villages had inspired me to start raiding some of the Battanian villages. Even though this seemed like a good idea, it was distracting me from defending my castles. A huge party of over 1,200 Sturgian troops had made their way over to the castle of Pendraic. They put it under siege, and I had snuck into the castle walls to try and defend it. As usual during sieges, I employed my regular strategies. All of my troops had poured out of the castle unexpectedly. We started ambushing all of the enemy soldiers around the siege equipment. It wasn't long until the enemies received reinforcements and we had ended our little ambush. We were able to take out around 60 enemy units, which wasn't bad. Surely enough, right after the ambush, the enemies decided to attack. So it was time to load the walls with all of my swordsmen. I even was able to fit my horse on top of the gate this time. The Great Siege had begun. All of the enemies started marching their way towards the castle. Once again, they were grouping up, and I was on the catapult, doing what I do best. Things were going the same way that they were last siege. The enemy troops were pretty much just standing there while they waited for their siege equipment to progress forward. Their battering ram had made it all the way over to the front gate. This was making me a bit nervous. Actually, to be honest, it made me very nervous. I even ended up destroying some of my own defenses with the rocks meant for that battering ram. The gates had been breached. I really didn't know what to do. all of the enemies were pouring in to the second gate. I tried throwing as many rocks as I possibly could down at the enemies attacking. It was only a matter of seconds until we had run out of boulders. That's when I told a good chunk of my melee to head over to the front gate. We must defend this thing with our lives. Except for me, I was on the ballista. Now you might be wondering why I wasn't in the front line helping my troops. I saw an opportunity in trying to take out as many possible enemies with the ballista in the tower. This seemed like it would be a whole lot more effective. Once I got up there though, I realized that none of the enemies were really in range to be hit. I then started shooting my crossbolts into the crowds of enemies trying to attack us. Not too long after, they had decided to retreat. We were victorious. Honestly, this siege kinda scared me. That army had made it the furthest that any other army has ever made it during a siege. That defense was so intense, it made me realize I wasn't going to be able to fight off both kingdoms at the same time. I decided that I would declare peace with Battania, as I was winning the war against them. They accepted and gave me a decent amount of gold per day. This now made things a little bit easier to handle. It was no longer a 2v1, but rather a 1v1. Only having to worry about one war was a huge relief. I ended up upgrading some of my troops and hiring some new ones. That was when I noticed a large Sturgian party heading towards the lands of Vortide. Now this was getting ridiculous. I couldn't even get a break from fighting. I could not defend against another siege. I was so sick of being locked behind walls for days at a time. This rush of emotions made me rally all of the parties of Vortide. Once we were all together, I had finally started to attack the enemy Sturgian party. They were in the middle of sieging my castle, but this time, I set up an ambush. I was willing to do anything to avoid fighting another siege, even if it meant fighting a battle with the odds stacked against me. I used my usual strategy of riding ahead and taking out as many enemy horsemen as I possibly could. This for sure evened the tide of the battle. It was now time to send the troops in. Things really weren't going as planned. I was losing a lot more troops than anticipated. I was honestly seeing more of my men being taken out than the enemies. This was pretty concerning, but it was still the beginning of the battle, so we had time. As time progressed, all of my infantrymen and ranged units were taken out. Only the cavalry survived. The Sturgians were in a complete opposite scenario. All of their cavalry was taken out, but they still had range and infantrymen. It's a good thing that my cavalry units are some of the most powerful in all of the lands. To further prove that point, my cavalry, being the only units left that I had completely demolished the enemies even though we were outnumbered by them. Also, almost none of them had died. They were the final survivors at the end of the battle. After the fight, I disbanded my army. It was very important to me to make sure that all of the parties of Vortide were in tip-top shape. So disbanding and allowing them to rest and recruit some more troops was the ideal move. That was when the unthinkable happened. My former mercenaries had completely quit their jobs. We no longer had additional parties roaming around the lands to defend them. I will have my revenge on the clan of the Hand. Until then, I'm gonna have to try and find a replacement clan. Despite the bad news of losing my mercenaries, I had received some good news. Nogan and Nadia's child was born. This once again meant that the Vortide family was growing. We'll be the most powerful family in all of Calridia before you know it. First off though, I gotta make sure we don't get destroyed by this massive Sturgian army. Even though I wanted to avoid sieges, defending Pendraic was necessary. There was no way I was gonna be able to take on 800 enemy troops against my 400 in the middle of a battlefield. So I was back to it, using a whole bunch of siege equipment and ambushes to slowly chip away at the enemy army. Our first ambush was successful. We had taken out a significant amount of enemy troops, over 300 to be more precise. I then was able to sneak in another ambush. This one wasn't as successful as we only ended up taking out around 100 troops. Hey, I'm not gonna complain. The enemies only had 490 now instead of over 800. I knew for a fact I would be able to take on a battle of 500 versus 300. So I made my way out to the middle of the battlefield and started to attack the enemy forces. The first Sturgian that I had taken out was one of the generals. This wasn't luck, it was skill. I made sure to target the enemies that were most important first. This had a huge mental impact on the enemy troops. The enemies weren't even able to hold steady. They were all over the place. They weren't able to hold a single formation no matter what, and our cavalry charges were just disrupting them even more. Surely enough, the kingdom of Vortide succeeded. We were definitely playing defense a bit too much lately. I decided it was time to rally the troops and take it to the enemy's heart, their homelands. The first thing that I did when I arrived in the Sturgian lands was attack a random general. I then scouted out a bunch of Sturgian castles until I found one that had less than 200 defenders. This bad boy was my target. As we were constructing our siege camp, I had received word that my son, Inric, had reached a milestone age. Some information that made me really happy was that Inric had picked up on some of my social skills. I unfortunately wasn't able to celebrate because we were in the middle of a siege. The second that our camp was ready, I had rushed all of my troops to the left side of the castle. There was an enemy catapult in the top left tower, so it made sense to get really close to it so it wouldn't be able to take out a huge chunk of our troops. Even though we were taking precautions against this catapult, on the way over to the walls, it was able to get off one shot. Thankfully enough, it had only taken out about 7 soldiers. We arrived at the walls and started getting the ladders up as quickly as possible. I wasn't going to be the first one to climb up them, because if I had gotten taken out, then who would lead the assault? My troops started flooding in, and I was shooting a bunch of enemies with my crossbow. When the time was right, I started scaling the walls and headed into the castle. It looked like all of the enemies were just retreating. This meant that we now owned the castle. What a successful siege! The only downfall about taking over a castle in the Sturgian lands was that it's so far from the rest of the kingdom. If we're gonna have to defend this castle, when we're gonna have to defend this castle, it's going to be very hard. As I was making my way deeper into the Sturgian lands, I had noticed a giant army of 500. This was a little ridiculous, so I decided to see how many dinars we would get from making peace with the Sturgians. It appeared to be around 100. Now that's not bad, especially when it gets us out of the war. As I was heading back to the Vortian homelands, I had noticed a city rebelled. I went to go scout it out. Unfortunately enough, I saw that the Vlandians had already made their way over here and were sieging the town back. This wasn't a wasted trip, because I had gotten information that Carbanseth was going to rebel soon. We just had no idea when. If I time this perfectly, I'll be able to take over my very first town. I started selling as much loot as I possibly could. I needed to make sure we had a whole bunch of extra dinars if we were going to own a town. I then started recruiting some more troops and selling off even more loot. I found myself back in the Vlandian lands, but they weren't too far away from Carbanseth, because obviously once the rebellion happens, I need to be nearby to take it over. I honestly spent so much time waiting. I even rallied and disbanded my army a couple different times. Time really felt like it was taking forever. I even headed back over to the castle of Pendraic to make sure everything was going smoothly. Of course, that's when the rebellion happened. I wasn't prepared at all, and my troops were nowhere nearby. So I just headed over to a random rebellion party and decided to attack it. This looked like one of the most powerful parties that they had, so it made sense to attack them now and take them out before my troops arrived and we were sieging the castle. Right as all of my men had joined my party, I rode over directly to the town and besieged it. Geez, those are some of the fastest builders I've ever seen. The rebellion town had immediately put up 2 catapults and 1 ballista. I didn't want to mess around with any siege equipment, so right as the camp finished building, I had sent my troops in to attack. It seemed like the left side of the castle strategy worked out really well in the last siege, so I decided that we would use the same strategy for this one. Let's hope it works. I didn't want to wait until the siege was practically over this time to get up onto the castle walls, so I went and found a random sword on the ground and started scaling one of the ladders. Right as I made it atop of the walls, I had seen a sight that I was a little bit confused about. It looked like there was a pit full of a bunch of enemy archers. There was no one really defending the actual walls. This strategy had me super confused until I felt the wrath of it. As I was trying to fight off 2 enemy soldiers, I got hit by at least 3 or 4 different arrows. Now I see what their idea is, but it's still unconventional. The giant group of enemy archers was scattering across the castle very quickly. As I was fighting on another side of the walls, I had seen the giant mob of archers just randomly running by. I ended up running out a bolt and picked up a longbow to launch arrows directly into the crowd. I was pretty impressed with how good the longbow was. Maybe I gotta get myself one of these. After fierce resistance, we had finally taken over the town of Carbanseth. This was the very first town that ever belonged to the kingdom of Vortide. Now I just needed to crush the last of the rebellion. Once they're gone, we'll fully own this castle and have nothing to worry about. I might have spoke too soon. I realized that the loyalty of this castle was going down significantly each day. Essentially, this means if I don't get the loyalty down anytime soon, I'm gonna have to be dealing with a rebellion of my own. As Carbanseth was constructing fairgrounds to try and improve the loyalty, I chased down some of the enemy rebels. Well, they stood absolutely no chance. It seemed like we had a whole bunch of good things coming in, one after another. Right after taking out the rebels, I had learned that Sylvan had given birth to our second child. It was a girl, and we named her Beswinda. Sylvan picked the name, by the way. With everything going on, I wasn't even able to check out the keep of Carbanseth yet. Now that I was finally here, I realized that it was massive. It was also a little bit disorganized, but hey, I'm not gonna complain. We own this whole thing. I lounged around for quite a while, and then I went to go talk to Sylvan. I wanted to spend some quality time with her. Well, it's time to get back to reality. I headed back out into the real world. That was when I noticed the Castle of Pendraic's loyalty was incredibly low. I had to change its priority to festival and games to make sure that this castle didn't rebel. Of course, I couldn't get a break. In the midst of this loyalty situation, the Battanians had declared war on me again. How many times am I gonna have to beat these guys in war to show them not to mess with me? Apparently, that number's at 4 or 5, because that's what we're on at this point. After taking out a few more Battanians, I saw a rebellion party. I immediately chased after it and took it out. That's just one less thing I have to deal with now. I handled a few more Battanian parties, and then made my way over to my castle in the Sturgian lands. It happened to be under siege by the Battanians. It seems like I'm never gonna really get a break until I completely dismantle the Battanian kingdom. If you want to get more involved in the Vortide community, check out my Discord linked down below. There's some incredible lore that links the videos together, as well as a really cool leveling system. Join now.